Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. I'm excited once again, and I know I say this every time. I'm super excited for my next guest, but it's true. This podcast has been awesome. I've met a lot of great people, and today's guest is no exception. I've got Chief Neil Dubord, or is it Dubord?
Dubord. You're right on the money.
All right, and Chief Dubord is in Delta. The Delta PD in Vancouver, up in our northern brothers and sisters up in Canada. Welcome to the show.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. And you do amazing work here. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you and all of your listeners.
Well, did I get that right in terms of like how I described Delta PD being in Vancouver?
Kind of, sort of. So we're on the West Coast, obviously, and we are a suburban environment just outside of Vancouver. So from downtown Vancouver, I am about 30 minutes, basically. And from the outskirts of Vancouver, I'm probably, 15 minutes or so, something like that. But we are a community of about 110,000 people, and our police department is 210 sworn officers and about another 90 non-sworn or civilian workers, about 300 total.
And the way you guys are set up in Canada, like here in the States, and particularly in the Midwest, we have a city agency. We have a city that's right next to us that has their own agency. We have a university, a Big Ten university that has their own PD, and then we have sheriff's departments. And then sheriff's departments cover the county. They generally run the jails. And then we also have the state police. State police has jurisdiction everywhere. I mean, officers in Indiana technically have jurisdiction throughout the whole state once they get their Indiana law enforcement accreditation. However, we generally only work inside of our jurisdictions unless there's a case need to go outside of that. Is that similar to how you guys are structured in Canada?
It's a great question. And I may get some of my numbers wrong here in relation to my US numbers, but I believe there's about 18,000 police agencies in the US, somewhere like that. And I would say 700,000 police officers. Is that about correct?
Yep. 800,000. It all depends on kind of who you talk to and what they're classifying as an officer. But yeah.
So in Canada, just to give you some idea of scope, there's only 68,000 police officers across Canada, and there's about 270 police agencies. So typically our police agencies are in major centers, but we do have municipal policing, which is very similar to your municipal policing. We have provincial or state policing, and provincial policing in British Columbia, where I'm at, the province I'm in, is the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And then we do have federal policing, which would be similar to your three-letter agencies in the States, and that would be the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as well. So the Mounted Police, the RCMP, do municipal policing in some cities. They do provincial policing in some provinces. And of course, they do the federal policing across Canada.
Right on. Here a little story. Like my very first exposure to policing in Canada, and I don't know why, sometimes you think, well, different country, different rules, different structure. But this is when Blackwater was still Blackwater out on the East Coast in Moyock. And I was going through a advanced hostage rescue school back in my tactical days. And there were groups from all over the world, quite frankly. But when I was there, we had a group from Toronto, and that was kind of like, I don't know why I was surprised, but I was like, oh my gosh, these guys are freaking awesome. Like they were super square. Of course, they were a full-time team too. They're squared away. Yes. Just great operators, but
well, it's funny, right? East Coast, West Coast is similar in Canada as well. So because I'm on the West Coast originally from Edmonton, sort of the province next to British Columbia, Alberta, it's called. I was in we called it tactical or ERT team or SWAT team, whatever name you want to use. I was there, and we had 3 full-time teams, and I was, in that particular unit for about 11 years of my career, and great opportunity, great career. But we always trained on the West Coast, right? So we went to LAPD and LA County Sheriffs for our training. That's where we got most of our tactical training.
Yeah, isn't that funny? It's weird where we look to get our training. I mean, geography plays a big part of it too, and costs, and what can you do, what can you get to? But also, I think there's just kind of, we have these ideas in our mind about what is good training and what's not good training, and who's squared away, who's not. So,
You know what's good
yeah,
training is
it's
always
funny.
the training you get, right? We always think whatever training we get is the best.
Yeah, there's no bad training. There's
That's
only
right.
better training, right? So, but
Yeah.
we could talk for hours just about that. But so great opportunity to transition. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career? You're now the chief of the Delta Police Department, but that's not where you started your career. You worked in a major metropolitan police department, and maybe let's kick it back to there a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm blessed with a great career. And, certainly anyone listening that is thinking of a policing as a career, I can't encourage them enough to be able to think very seriously about it. Been blessed for what it offers me, both professionally, personally, and certainly for my support of my family. But in saying that, I started in Edmonton, Alberta, so the home of the Edmonton Oilers, if anyone's a hockey fan. And,
A lot of hockey fans down here. Yeah.
oh, that's good. Yes. Yeah. So, and Edmonton would be a community of about 1 million people. And the police organization is about 1,800 sworn officers. That's where I began. And like anyone, I did my time in patrol and walking the beat, and we were, advancing community policing within our community. And then I ended up going into our tactical team and spent a long period of time there as an operator, a sniper, and then into the entry team, on to being the commander of the unit. At that point in time in Canada, we call it the staff sergeant, which I believe is the lieutenant in equivalent in the States. And then I went on to be the senior officer, the inspector in charge of that unit, in charge of K9 and our helicopters. And Edmonton has a couple of helicopter units that they fly. So I was blessed there. I spent 25 full years. And in 2012, I left to take a job as the chief of the transit police in the Vancouver area. So in transit, or in Vancouver, they have a large transit system, and they had an opportunity to be a leader in that particular organization. And I was successful in being able to take on that role, and spent 3 years there from 2012 to 2015. And then in 2015, I came over to the Delta Police Department, which is a suburb of Vancouver, as I mentioned. And it's been a great transition, and just absolutely blessed in sort of all I've been able to do and all I've been able to learn.
So Edmonton, I think you said it, but it's in Calgary, right? And that's you had around 2,300 officers total. Or maybe it's employees, but so how is, and again, just for the education of the listeners, what is there any real difference in the way you structure a police organization in Canada? Or are we all working off of Peelian principles, where we have that paramilitary structure? You've got administration, you've got patrol, you've got investigations, maybe special operations. Is it? I assume it's probably the same.
It is very similar. So we all belong to major city chiefs, and we all belong to the IACP, obviously, and the CACP, which is the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. And Edmonton, Calgary are the two big cities in Alberta. You're right. Calgary has about 2,300 members, and a good friend of mine now is the chief there in Calgary, who used to work in the Edmonton Police Service. And we always call Calgary the Texas of Alberta, right? It's a little bit more cowboy. It's kind of a fun place to work. So he does a great job, Mark Neufeld, up there. But in saying that, the structure is almost identical, right, in relation to what you would see in a metropolitan city in the States as well. So it is, it's certainly a paramilitary structure. There is, the ability for us to bring in non-sworn, deputy chief level that runs sort of the administration bureau of the particular area. And then you'd have your operations area, your investigation area, and, any special ops that you would do.
Awesome. Well, we got a lot of ground to cover today. But before we get into that too, I also, one of the things that I think is fascinating is, fascinating or not, maybe it's just fascinating to me because I'm a former TAC guy. You're a former TAC guy. It just seems, and we're both really talking about wellness and performance optimization, and it just seems that the push to wellness often, it's not always, but generally speaking, comes from people that have that type of background. You also are the host of a podcast called the Bend Don't Break podcast, and we'll come back to that at the end. Remind me to come back to that at the end so we can make sure that listeners know where to go to find you. And but in your podcast, you're talking about resilience, mental health, wellness, and you have a mantra where you say from hire to retire, come in strong, leave stronger. And one of the things we like to talk about is hire healthy and retire healthy and optimize that space in between. So do you think that's by coincidence that
It's funny, right? I've got to compliment you in relation to what you've done for the wellness area around policing, and I know that you've paid attention to that for many, many years as you were the chief, and it's so important, right? It sets culture. It provides the ability for people to be inspired at their work, to be highly engaged in their work, and maybe it comes from working on teams. The ability to work on a team, you sort of understand that dynamic, and you understand the importance of everyone contributing at the optimum level. And when you work on a team like that, it's just so critical to be able to ensure that everyone is well, because you're depending on them. You need them to be well in order for your team to have success. So maybe that's how it goes into the DNA, right? And maybe that's sort of certainly my interest in it is that highly engaged employee who can contribute well and then ultimately serve the community. On the back end, the outcome is that if they're well, they're able to serve the community.
Yeah. And the flip side, if they're not well, we tend to find out through really bad performance that we've watched in a body cam video, or that they've gotten themselves into a situation that could jeopardize their character, their integrity, or quite frankly, it can damage reputations of agencies. And yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition because while we really like to think that all police officers, this is something that they want to engage in and that they're excited about it, but I'm not going to speak for the Canadian side of the border, but in the U.S., yeah, it's a mixed barrel. There's a lot of officers that don't want police departments to have any say in what their physical health is, what their physical fitness levels are. There's a lot of resistance to create standards and measurement ways to measure those standards. So, police unions, Indiana's not a police union state, but there's still strong FOP, backing for a lot of these things. So it's kind of weird when you think about it, right? People enter this profession knowing that their physical and mental health will, have a significant role in how well they perform on the job, which could, quite frankly, mean, a matter of life and death for themselves or the people that they've sworn to protect. So same thing up there in Canada, or is are you guys all just like super fit athletes? And
I wish, right? Same issue here, right? You have to take care of your heart, you have to take care of diabetes, you have to take care of the important things physically. But we always talk about whole person health and the ability to look after your emotional health, your financial health, your spiritual health, your mental health, obviously your physical health. And we have 7 kind of categories or dimensions that we often talk about here in the Delta Police Department. And we, that relates to the whole person. And if I don't have a whole person that's, who's worried about bankruptcy, who's worried about a divorce, who's worried about a sick child, that all contributes to the level of service that we provide. And, ultimately, as the leader of any organization, we're concerned with the level of service that's provided. But by doing the right thing, and doing the right thing is taking care of our people. So that's so important.
And I think I love that approach. What are the, I'm going to put you on the spot here. What are those 7 categories?
Oh, no. Okay. We call them the 7 F's. So let me see if I can.
7 F's.
Yeah. Let me see if I can remember them here. So financial is 1, faith, or we call it spiritual. Faith is how we use the F there. We use physical health, so fitness, we say. Oh no, I'm going to have, before the end of this, I will go into my 7 F's and I will give them to you. I promise.
No, I do like that. because and the point that I was making, if you're not performing optimally, then not only do you run the risk of having some type of performance issue that, that could be it could be a safety issue, it could be, a poor performance in terms of an investigation or something, but it has implications on the personal side as well.
Sure does.
And you hit it. You talked about heart disease and taking care of your heart. That's the number one killer of police officers is cardiovascular disease, 18 times greater than the risk of being assaulted and killed in the line of duty. But yet, this is a question that we ask, and I've done trainings around the country, and when you ask people, like, how many people have trained on their firearm this year? Of course, everybody has, right? And that's what you would expect. And then you ask how many people here have trained in heart attack prevention, and there's no hands that go up. So yeah, and all the systems really, they're all interconnected. Nothing is separate. So if you've got insulin resistance, if you have type 2 diabetes, then you're running the risk of cardiovascular disease, which is putting stress on the system, which in turn is impacting your ability to go out and perform your best when you're at work.
You're so right. And okay, here comes the 7F. See, I told you I would look it up and make sure I tell you. So fitness, feelings, family and friends. So relationships, financial, faith or spiritual, field. And what we mean by field is your career, your job, right? Making sure that you're in the right posting. And finally, fatigue, sleep. As you know, sleep management being so critical. And we're learning more and more about that all the time.
And you're right up there, bordering with Washington. So Washington State University, Brian Beal's work up there, Retired Cops. I always encourage people to read that, but he was sounding the alarm on this a long time ago, and sadly, it hasn't really resonated. We haven't really made a whole lot of changes inside the profession to improve sleep.
You're so right. And right there, our shifts don't help. I mean, everyone loves the 12-hour shift. I'm not sure what you're working there, but our 12-hour shift, 4 days on, 4 days off, is a wonderful shift to have days off. But certainly we know it isn't meant for optimum sleep and optimum performance. That 10-hour shift or even an 8-hour shift, the research shows that are much better. But certainly I'm not going to see that ever happen in my career here in Canada for sure. The 12-hour shift is here to stay.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up. I was involved in an allocation study that we went through back in 2007, 8, 9 timeframe, and we looked at the patrol allocation work that was being done at Northwestern, and we were trying to find what those optimum shifts were, because you're trying to balance, quite frankly, back then, right? The early days of the saying now, work-life balance. Well, we were working 8-hour shifts that generally tended to be 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 4 p.m. to midnight to 8 a.m. And you had fixed days off. So if for a young guy like me, I always preferred to work the midnight to 8 a.m. because that's when all the action was. That's when I wanted to be there. And I always wanted to work Friday and Saturday nights because those were the busy nights. So and also having the lowest seniority, because shift bid was done by seniority. I knew, well, there probably isn't much of a, worry about me getting Monday and Tuesday off and being able to work the busy nights. Now, that's when you're young and you can't believe you're getting paid to go out and do this job. But, as time goes on and you get families and other people that are relying on you, then trying to get a day off or making sure you have weekends off is a bit of a challenge. So,
Costco's way better on a Tuesday morning than it is on a Saturday morning. I can guarantee you that.
Those are the hidden benefits of working nights, right?
That's right. One of the things I will say is we used to use the term work-life balance a lot more, and now we call it work-life alignment. I'm more into, because the balance is never there. It's almost impossible to balance that because, as you mentioned, in certain parts of your lives, you have young children, you have other commitments that you need to be able to do, but we need to align the two so that they work together, as a system. And often we try to divide them, and many leaders will try to divide them. Leave your problems at home, right? Don't bring your problems to work. In the old Henry Ford quote, right? I asked for a hand and I ended up with a whole body. But the fact is that everyone brings all of themselves to work, and how we align those two so that optimum performance is there is so important.
Yeah. So when we looked at it, of course, the other thing that comes into play in that is you got to have the coverage. You got to have shift coverage. What's the shift that's going to optimize your manpower? That's going to give you the best coverage for, best bang for your buck. And I think, the studies have shown that those 10-hour shifts are probably the sweet spot, because you can create, you're not working a 12-hour shift. So, a 10-hour shift really means 12 hours. That's
Yes.
assuming that you have no overtime, because what I try to explain to people when you're describing what it's like, there's a minimum depending on how far you live from work too, but even if you just live 10 to 15 minutes from work, there's an hour gear up time to get ready to go to work. You're getting your uniform on, you're getting yourself mentally prepared, you're driving in, you're checking in, you're getting all your gear, everything assigned to you, however that works. And then you're hitting a roll call, and then you're hitting the street. And then by the time you're done on the back end, it's the reverse. And so,
And throw a workout in there, right? Throw an
yeah,
hour workout in there, and all of a sudden it's 13 hours on a 10-hour shift.
yes. And if you are a busy department and you're not staffed well enough, then what that means is you run call to call. So there's no time really to write reports while you're out on the street. So your report writing time comes when the next shift comes on. So you go back to the station or sit in your car, whatever it is, and now you're typing reports. And if you can get that done in time, when we were working 8-hour shifts, most officers had, a comp bank that was maxed out. Within a
Yes.
year, you were maxing out your comp bank, and depending on how your agency is paid out, it's different across communities and states. But some agencies would allow the maximum time in those banks, and then others would force you to get paid in overtime. But yeah, either way, there's a clock there's only 24 hours in a clock, and it doesn't, no matter how you slice it, you can't get 25 hours in a 24-hour day. Sometimes we convince ourselves that we can do that, but sooner or later it catches up. And so the 12-hour shift was really um, a nice opportunity to provide the biggest bang for your buck on the street, to get the most officers, to get you the best coverage, and also provide more continuous time off. So when you're working, you're in those work cycles, you're working a lot, you go home, you sleep, you come back to work. But then you have those longer rest periods where you can rest, recover in principle and theory, and then come back to work. And it
You're
also gives
absolutely
weekends off
yes.
for young officers. Like, I didn't have my first weekend off. Like, I don't think it was like, I don't know, like 8 or 10 years on the job before I had my first weekends off. And I know there was some people before me that waited longer. So when the chief at the time made the decision that we were going to go to 12-hour shifts, that was not very popular. There was a lot of veteran officers and veteran officer spouses, I think, still to this day, that, if they run into them in the grocery store, they won't even look at them. But
It's so true. Oh, no, you're absolutely right. And, the 12-hour shift, even we have very junior members now that have able to get vacation in the summertime. I don't know what it was like in your organization, but when I was a junior officer, the opportunity to get, a July and August vacation, forget it, right? My vacation was in February. So I see many junior officers now being able to enjoy vacation in the summertime with their family, which is wonderful.
yeah, well, at shift bid, we used to bid for a year at a time. So there were a lot of people that looked on the calendar, what day is Christmas on,
Yep.
what day are the holidays on, and those were the days off that they picked, because they knew that that's the only way I'm getting that day off. Otherwise,
Yeah.
everyone that's got seniority over me is going to have those days. And this is I think it's good background and maybe a good segue into having a conversation about how do we think about what the future of policing is going to look like? And in the midst of just these conversations, and we're talking before there was a time when we were really crunched on staff, like it wasn't a problem to find people to come in, knowing that this was going to be the case when they came into the profession, or at least you would tell them. And then sometimes the reality might kick in after they get on there. Like, you really mean I'm not getting weekends off for like 5 years? Yeah, we really meant it when we said that. And then they get angry and frustrated. But in this era, we're having a very difficult time recruiting new employees. We're having a difficult time retaining employees. People are retiring earlier and sooner than they historically have ever done. And that leaves you with a department that is stressed. The demand for services is still coming in. And outside of the police department, we have people that are saying the answer to our problems is to defund the police. That's going to fix everything, without any understanding or any idea of how, what the actual internal culture is really like. So that's a big piece of the pie to chunk off here. But
I'm going to jump in just for a second and be able to point everyone towards another podcast that I listen to. And I'm a huge Malcolm Gladwell fan. Yeah. And, he's written some tremendous books, but he does a podcast called Revisionist History. And the latest episode that was just released on July 27th talks about the taxonomy of the modern mystery story. And the podcast is just about an hour long, 50 minutes, I think it is. I'd encourage everyone to get through the first 20 minutes if you're a police officer, but the last portion of the podcast is amazing. And Malcolm goes on to be able to talk about how policing in general has been written about in books and in stories and in TV shows, and how it's positioned policing so that the way people understand it and interpret it is actually incorrect, because it is interpreted through the eyes of a writer. And he goes on to say that, how come a police officer in Florida that does something wrong impacts policing across North America? So the 19,000 police officers across North America, or I'm sorry, I guess in relation to across North America, it would be the 700,000 and 70,000 in Canada. So say 800,000 police officers across North America. And yet a teacher does the same thing, or a nurse does the same thing, and it does something horrible to a student or to someone else, and yet it doesn't impact the profession. And he goes on to explain that he believes that some of this is the way that policing is framed by writers, by TV shows, and by books. And it's a really good podcast for people to be able to get an understanding and appreciation of really how little the public understands about policing. And that works right into what you were saying in relation to defund, right? If you don't understand it, it's easy to say it's not working. But those that understand a little bit more and appreciate the challenges, and we'll get into it, Patrick, but the changing role of policing within our communities, if you don't understand that, it's easy to be able to say, you know what, let's take $1 million out of their budget and see what happens.
Yeah. And I think the more complicated, the more complex a problem is, the less likely people are going to engage in the solutions to really try to fix it, because the problem seems too big. And therefore, the default mode for, quite frankly, a lot more people than it used to be is just to not give it any thought at all. I can jump on social media. I can make a comment on Twitter. If I'm a person that has social standing in social media, even if I have no idea what goes on in law enforcement, somehow I now have credibility in the law enforcement space because I'm a celebrity or whatever. And I can say, the system's broken. Policing is bad. Policing needs to be fixed. And then you know what? They're done and they feel better about that. Like they've done something to fix, but all they've done is just throw another rock through another window and create more damage that's ultimately going to need to be repaired. And that can be really frustrating from the inside. But I haven't listened to that episode. I'm gonna have to get to that. And Malcolm Gladwell, I think a lot, one of his more popular books is called Blink, and maybe
Absolutely.
Maybe you've read that. But in that last chapter in that book is kind of like the perceptions of what happened in that. I believe it's the Abu Diallo shooting, where the NYPD, their TAC team, wound up shooting a suspect like 42 times in a dark stairwell. Turned out that he was unarmed. But do you remember that case? I
I
think
do
I'm
remember
thinking I'm
it.
clear,
Yes.
right?
And Blink, great book, right? And how he frames it. Yep.
Yeah. Well, the kind of the interesting thing about that case was it was all about perception. It's about what do I think in the moment that I'm thinking it, and what do I think is going to happen next? For a citizen that's never gone into a dark stairwell, wondering if they're going to encounter somebody that's armed or not, the police officer is primed to see weapons and to see things that might harm them, where people that have not been through that training or haven't had those experiences are maybe less inclined to be concerned. That's why when you run shoot no shoot scenarios with civilians, that's why you always see them making really really bad decisions.
Yes. Yes, we
Under
have a
stress.
simulator here in Delta, and we have the privilege of being able to put through some of our members of the media, and certainly our police board members and other people that carry strong opinions within the community. And it's wonderful to see sort of them struggle with situations and decision making in very complex and highly intensive situations.
Yeah, and they're always afterwards like, man, that was really hard. That's how do you do this? And it's like, well, I by practice and experience and stuff that takes a long time. And so therefore we need more time to train, more resources to train,
Yes.
yeah, not less. And yeah, I digress.
I'm going to, Pat, just for a second, I'm going to pick up a string and just pull a thread that you said there, and the time to train. And I don't know what it's like in the States, but our biggest problem here in Canada is that obviously there's never enough training time, but to bring police officers off the street and get them into a classroom for 1, 2, 3, 5 days is really, really difficult. It's expensive. You have overtime on the back end, overtime on the front end. It's just very, very difficult for us to be able to get that training time in. I'm not sure what it's like in the US.
Absolutely. Same everywhere. And I did a podcast with Inspector Sheehan from NYPD. He used to run the training division. So I would encourage people to go back and listen to that, because again, I'm a mid-sized agency here, and if I ever started to feel sorry for myself about things, that I was having trouble with, I was always like, you know what? I look to the chief at Indy Metro or people at NYPD and these huge organizations. Everything is a matter of scale, right? So, one of the conversations that I had with him is he assumed, community members, they say, oh, look, we want you to train in de-escalation. And we want you to use this method because an academic here says this is more effective. And I'm kind of filling in the blanks here, but it might be great training, and it might be the right thing to do. But to say that and have the expectation that next week everybody's in line and going to be following that training is like for the NYPD, where you're running 35,000 people through training. It's like it could literally take 2 years to run a training cycle. Can take 2 years to get everybody through.
Yeah.
So it's an agents, smaller agencies have a little bit more flexibility, but everybody, it's the demand, the calls for service keep coming in, and again, it's one of
Completely.
those things that just, I don't know. I think we do need to do a better job communicating this complexity to our communities to make sure that they understand that we do want to train. We want to train more, and that's I think the one thing that I think everybody can agree on, particularly in the post Ferguson days and the post Minneapolis days, is that more training is required, not less. And I don't know,
Yeah, you're
I
so right. And from mid-sized agencies, I mean, we're both from mid-sized agencies, and we're blessed with strong community support and blessed with strong city council support and police board support. And I mean, I can't imagine in larger cities where, similar to Seattle, that, have a city council that's really not supportive of a community that, I would say the majority of community probably does support, but unfortunately they don't have a loud voice at the table. And, they have significant complexities that I don't experience, and I'm fortunate not to have to experience.
Well, yeah, just look what happened there. I mean, Carmen Best, just a fantastic chief from all appearances, from the outside and from as a police chief, watching what she was doing and what she was trying to negotiate, and then look what happened to her. I mean, she was doing everything right and still got pushed out, and because people don't want to listen. I've got the answers. You're going to listen to me, and you mentioned cops and the medical profession earlier, and I kind of have this saying. I like to joke about it, but in a serious way, that there's several professions like cops, coaches, and teachers, that everybody that's watching thinks that they know more and can do better than the people that are actually doing it, right? Because
So true.
well, I'll use a hockey analogy, right? Since you're Canadian, like I played high school hockey. Therefore, when I'm sitting and I'm watching my Edmonton Oilers, I know what I know what sets the coach should be running, and can't everybody see it? I'm right here
Yeah.
on watching it on TV, and they get frustrated when things don't go their way. But I watched Hill Street Blues. I've watched Reno 911. I know what policing is like.
Bosh.
Yeah,
That's right.
I do like Bosch, but
Me too.
yeah, they're fun. They're fun to watch.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and the scrutiny is interesting, but
It sure
training,
is.
and this is I have some plans to have this conversation on some future podcasts, but and I've mentioned it briefly before. When you talk about the professionalization of police, I'd like to think, and I'm confident in saying that policing has never been better. It's just the scrutiny that we get has never been more intense. Therefore, there's sometimes it creates this misperception that things are broken when they're really not. It doesn't mean that we can't be doing things better. But if you want to do things better, then reinvesting and doubling down on investment, which includes technology, includes equipment, it includes training. A licensed cosmetologist is required to have 1,500 hours of training, and they have board certifications. Where a
Yes.
police officer, generally in the States, it's depending on which state you're in, it's anywhere from 400 to 700 hours of mandatory training, and now you're a certified officer, and that's just a basic level of competency, right? That's not your ongoing level of expertise.
Yeah, you're so right. You can never have enough of that, and certainly I encourage the continued professionalization. I think we're on the journey. We're definitely making ground, and it's a game of inches. But what I will say is that certainly what I see in the officers we're hiring is that they've never been better. They're brighter, smarter, more agile, more flexible, more ability to critical think and problem solve. And we hire some very bright people that are committed to the profession and willing to serve.
And things are changing. And a good segue. I really liked when we had a conversation before we went on the show. You were talking about in your agency, you do an organizational review every 4 years, and you focus on a couple of areas like core services, workload analysis, and ROI. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the core services are kind of like, what people, kind of like the average perception of what a police officer does. He goes out, makes traffic stops, he makes arrests, he does search warrants, and puts bad guys in jail. Is that kind of a good way to
Right on the
it?
money. So the core services really are the basics and the fundamentals that we need: our powers of arrest and our powers of search and seizure to be able to complete our duty as police officers. So if and things that no one else could do, like no one else that's other than a sworn police officer will be able to take someone's liberty away and be able to bring them forward on some sort of criminal charge or some other charge. So that's what we call core services.
You guys have how would it work in Canada? So in the US, we have these people that run around that call themselves First Amendment auditors, right? The First Amendment is the guaranteed protection of free speech. So they run around with video cameras, and they get police scanners, and they show up on calls, and they put cameras in people's faces and saying, we're out here doing a First Amendment audit. They do it a lot of different ways. So you have people that do that in
Interesting.
Canada as well.
No, we don't. We certainly have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So that's sort of our First Amendment rights, is that, everyone has the right to be able to be free. And we do protect the Charter of Rights very, very strictly, but we don't have sort of people out there demonstrating for it as well. So we're fortunate that way, that, or at least we don't see it here in Delta for sure.
The reason I bring that up is because the power to arrest is never to be taken lightly. And when we pound that into young police officers, right? You're like, we're giving you a tremendous amount of responsibility. You're one of the only people in society that can literally go take away somebody else's rights. You can go into their house, put them in handcuffs, drag them out to a squad car, and take them to jail. And that should be so. Citizens should be engaged and understand and know if that's being done well, if it's being done effectively. But what I would also say is, like, I don't necessarily know that we want everyone being able to do that, right? If there was the power of citizens arrest, would need to be closely monitored. So those core services, there's a reason why we only grant those to a very small number of police, and we expect a high level of professionalism from them. Otherwise, can you imagine what chaos would ensue, especially in, like, let's go back to COVID. Are
Oh
you
my
wearing your
goodness.
mask, or are
Yeah,
you not
that's right.
wearing your mask? Like, citizens mask arrest. You're
Imagine
going.
the scene at Walmart. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, you're right. It should never be taken lightly. And unfortunately, at times in policing, there's no doubt, as you begin to become more senior, you sometimes forget how much of you will change someone's life in that moment, right? In that moment of arrest. And we just have to always recognize that there's a high tolerance and a high level that must be reached in order for us to be able to enact those kind of powers.
So workload analysis. Tell me what you look at when you do your workload analysis.
Absolutely. That's the easier one, probably, of the two. It's data rich and it's hard data. So it's about how many calls our officers are going to, how long they're taking for their calls, what it takes to write up an arrest report, what amount of work we're doing on the investigative side compared to the straight call response. How many calls we're responding to are actually criminal code related as compared to maybe in the human services, sort of that community safety and well-being piece. So it's the whole analysis of the work that we do and whether or not that work is efficient, how we could make it more efficient, and how we can restructure the organization. So let me give you just one example of the last one, is that we found that the majority of our calls for service, or a large percentage of them, were coming between the hours of noon and midnight, right? Which would not be uncommon for everyone else. So what we did, instead of just the straight 12-hour shifts from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, we started what we called a power shift, and that power shift would start at noon. So it's nothing unusual that anyone else in the business doesn't do, but from our work, we decided that we had a better way to be able to deploy our team to make sure that we had lots of coverage during the times when we're busiest. So then we had a team from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., a team from noon to midnight, and a team from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m.
Yeah, I'm gonna touch on that for just a minute, because we do something very similar. And there was definitely a transitional period where, kind of old school policing, where you showed up to work, you got in your car and you drove around and you got to know people, what we would call today community policing. That was just everyday policing. But maybe not necessarily a high level of accountability at the individual level, or even at the shift level, to know, well, how are we using our time? If we don't understand what we're doing with our time, how do we know if we're right staffed? How do we know if we have enough people? So here's an example that I used to use when I was explaining this to commanders. If you go to the grocery store, oh, let's just, what'd you say? It wasn't Costco or whatever. If you go to the store at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, it's probably not going to be too busy, right? So you've got free reign in the store. You can go around, pick up all your groceries. And back in the day, when you actually didn't have to check yourself out, you could find a register that wasn't busy, and you could make your way through, and you're out. Now, if you go to that same store the day before Christmas or 2 days before Christmas at 4 in the afternoon, when everybody's getting off at work, it's a dogfight in there. People are fighting over turkeys and everything else in the store, and then they're jockeying for lines. And if you staffed your grocery store on that day the same and time period the same way you did on a Tuesday morning, well, guess what's going to happen? We call in our line of work, we call that call stacking, right? There's nobody there to take there's nobody. Yeah, okay, I get it. You want the police there, but there is nobody available. And guess what? There's 20 other people that are ahead of you that also have a priority call that want us to get to. So when you're staffing, you have to look at things this way. How do we make sure that we're providing the right service to the right priority at the right time? And there's only one way to do that, and that's to know, like, what are we doing with our time? So I love to hear when other agencies are being detailed like that and looking, because the next thing, we'll roll right into it, ROI. What's the value of the money for the work that we're doing, that return on investment, for a community. If you have an agency that doesn't pay attention to these types of details, you could say, hey, a chief there might say, we need 100 police officers. We've only got 75. Well, why? Well, because we're really busy. Well, explain to me how busy you are. Well, my gosh, my guys are telling me every day that we're busy. And what does that mean? And if you can't explain that, like, well, here's what, here's how we're busy, and be able to provide those details. So I assume that's what you use that for.
Absolutely. But I'm not going to let you get off that easy in relation to workload analysis, Patrick. And where I'll go on this, I want to talk about two failures that we tried here that didn't work for us. And often we learn more from our failures than from our successes, as you know. Is that we also tried to implement something on our investigative bureau where we would track time in 15-minute blocks, similar to what a lawyer would do. They do it in a minute block or 2-minute blocks. But so we asked them every 15 minutes to be able to document to an app in relation to what they were doing. And we tried to sort of get a figure as well. How much does a homicide cost us? How much does a serious sexual assault cost us? And boy, culture didn't accept that very well. So we didn't do very well on that. And we eventually had to pull it. Imagine that, right? Yeah. So yeah, we didn't have. And the other thing we did that was a kind of a mini success is we did a time and motion study. So we actually had someone drive around with patrol officers and record every 15 minutes. So time and motion, what they were doing, right? And again, it wasn't hugely successful, but we did get a little bit better picture of where time was spent, because you're right, the policing profession can be somewhat unaccountable in relation to how time is spent. And it isn't like a lawyer's office where everything is documented minute by minute and charged minute by minute. So we were trying to get a handle on that. And again, didn't work that well. I'll just flip really quickly over to return on investment. That's exactly right. Is that what are we doing where there is absolutely no value in being able to produce an outcome that we're after? So we have a strategic plan. We call it the community safety and well-being plan. And if the activity that we're doing doesn't support that plan, then why are we doing it? And is there an ROI on it? So that's how we use that.
I'm going to go back. So now I got to go back, because that's fascinating that you were doing that. And the app, so this was something that you were asking your investigators to use to help you guys kind of get a handle on more the minute to minute.
We were two things we were trying to do on that. We were trying to put a cost to investigation. So how much does a homicide cost us? So we were trying to get a real good idea of what the actual person cost was, that in the time they spent. In addition, we were trying to figure out how we actually rationalize how we add staff. We wanted to be able to show that. Unfortunately, it was seen as somewhat restrictive and somewhat authoritarian, and it was, the eye in the sky was watching, and it was seen, as a way to be able to manage their time, which wasn't the intention at all. The purpose was to be able to actually support them in their work and be able to put a cost on these investigations, but it didn't come out quite that way.
Yeah, that's interesting that because I experienced something very similar. and I was getting a little pushback. And what I ultimately figured out is, well, I'm not communicating well enough what it is that I'm trying to do. Um, and so for our staff, they're required every month. We have a spreadsheet that tracks the number of calls they respond to, the number of citations they issue, the number of traffic citations, number of arrests, number of backup calls that they're on, and we automate this. So we grab the data out of CAD and out of RMS, and we automate the process as much as possible, because it's not something that I wanted commanders to really have to worry about. I didn't want them to sit there and having to like build these spreadsheets every month. And we did that for one primary reason, and that is so the commanders themselves have a good understanding of what they're doing with their time on shift, and what what our investigative leaders, so we understand as administrators, where do we need to help them? Where do we need additional resources? And there you can really get down into the weeds on these kind of conversations, because just thinking in your case there, when you're asking your investigators like every 15 minutes, well, if you take a seasoned homicide investigator and compare them side by side with someone that may be a high potential investigator, but they're just new, those times aren't going to be the same, right? Like a seasoned
Yes.
investigator is going to be able to cut through the mayo a lot quicker than a new one. Like they just have to kind of find their way. So
You had mentioned, I think you're a Simon Sinek fan as well. So, yeah, I mean, start with the why, right? As you move towards any cultural change, if they understand the why, the next piece, the who and the what, is easier to get to. And maybe that was part of the problem, is the why wasn't understood well enough by our detective bureau to be able to manage that change. But coming back to what the community expectation is, you're absolutely right. You'll have any 80-year-old woman in a house who has a break-in, and I think it's called a burglary in the States. We call it a break-in here in Canada. And they have never had the opportunity to call the police ever in their lives.
right.
So now, what level of service should we provide that one call to that one person who has contributed to the municipal tax base their entire life, and yet give a short shift call in relation to how you respond to that? It just isn't right. You have to make sure you're always delivering that high level of service, and the expectation has to be that, this is going to be the one and only time they call the police. And we all know that we go to the same house many, 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 many times often, right? And that's often our frequent customers. But the community expectation is changing dramatically, at least here in Canada. We know that we have a very similar agency to you. We have about 28,000 reports a year is what we write out of all the CAD calls we get. So about, the same sort of volume that we're talking about. And we're finding that of those 28,000 reports that we're writing, only about 20% are criminal code kinds of reports. The rest are what I'm going to call human services. And the human services is, it's a homeless person, it's an addicted person, it's someone who's experiencing, wealth or poverty, it's someone who's experiencing addiction, it's all these other disturbances and people issues that we deal with 80% of the time. So the work of a police officer is changing from what we, often when we joined, it was core services running call to call to call. We always called it the big smoke, running from call to call.
The big smoke, I like that.
Yeah.
I'm writing that down.
Not anymore, right? The work is changing, and we have to hire and train our police officers differently, because the expectation from our community is different.
Yeah. And yeah, this is interesting. This is really interesting. So what we wound up doing, and at the end of that, one of the reasons, then the explanation that I was able to give to them is like, we're at a crossroads here, right? In our community, we have to really get them to understand what it is that we're doing with our time, because you do have people that tend to contribute the least but demand the most, and
It's
that
true.
pulls away time and resources from the people that contribute the most but demand the least. And it's kind of the squeaky wheel gets all the attention type of analogy, but it's true in policing. And The other way, because COVID kind of forced our hand in a few things that I think were very beneficial in those quality of life calls, what you that we refer to those types of calls that are non-criminal related, more quality of life type of issue. If the community's expectation is that we're going to send police officers there, but we only have X number of officers, and I can show you the math. I have good data that says here's our obligated time, here is our unobligated time, here's what we're doing for you right now. So let's get you engaged in this conversation about, well, what is it that you expect from the police? And can we even meet your minimum or core expectations? Because if we can't, you need to know that. And you need to know so we can provide, whatever it is. Do we need more police officers? Do we need different technology? Do we need better equipment? What is it? But what we don't want to do is fall short of expectations because we have false expectations set.
You're right on the money. It is an evaluation of what the community expectation is. And that goes right into, and it plays perfectly into what I mean by the changing role of policing. Some communities have said that it is not the best use of a police officer to be able to go to a mental health call. If it's not a violent mental health call, there are better ways to be able to service that. Some communities have said there are better ways to be able to deal with addiction problems than sending a police officer to deal with that, right? There are specialty people. And other communities have said, no, we want our police to do that. And yet there's probably a third type of community that says, well, we can't afford to send that counselor, that addiction specialist, that mental health specialist at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we want our police to do both. We want our police not to respond between 8 and 4, but anytime outside of 8 and 4, we want our police to respond. And we want them to be as good or better than the specialists, right? So
Yeah.
you've got these three kinds of expectations that as a leader of an organization, you have to be very in tune with what your community expects, and not just the loud few voices, but the majority of the voices, and what, sometimes the silent middle says and how they feel about this. Because ultimately, you're right, they are paying our wages and we want to do the best we can to serve them. And we take great pride in being able to serve them properly.
So let's dig into that one a little bit, because that's a great example, because that's a very important quality of life call. And especially, if mental illness generally runs hand in hand with addiction, it's usually, addiction usually, in not every case, but in many cases, people are self-medicating for undiagnosed mental illness issues. But regardless of how you get there is an expectation for the public safety to respond to these types of calls. And there can be oftentimes an element of danger to this, but sometimes there's not. So in these last few years, Seattle's lost I think 2 or 3 of these, whether they call them community navigators or they have different names for them, but they've been assaulted and killed.
Yes.
And, that doesn't get a lot of attention.
No, it's sad, very sad.
So that and I haven't listened to the Gladwell podcast, but I got it written down. I'm definitely going to go listen to that, because, what's the message that we're sending is, we're going to send in, quite frankly, most of the social services people that I know are like, I'm not going to that call without you guys.
Right on. That's right.
For people that don't work in this industry, they can volunteer me for that job all they want, but if they're not willing to get off their ass and go do it themselves, I'm not going to go out there without you guys. And
absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of ways to handle those types of calls, but really at its core, it's, well, what is the expectation then going to be? And I like to even go up a little bit upstream during these conversations, so sometimes, cops, we're problem solvers. Chiefs, we like to accept the challenge of doing something good for the community. So when they say, hey, we want you to respond to these calls and we want you to be crisis intervention trained, we want you to work with NAMI and other organizations, we're going to train you police officers to be able to handle these calls the best you can. And then guess what? So we say, okay, yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, we can do that. And these start with really good intentions, with really good partnerships. But then once we're out there doing it, guess what happens? Some of these other services, they start to fade away and they start to disappear. And then you're looking around like, hey, where'd everybody go? Why are we the only ones here on this call?
You
And it's
You are so right, right? We often talk about, or at least I often talk about, the need for us to be able to have oversight and coordination of all those efforts. We talked about, wellness in police agencies and talking about that being a system of whole person wellness. Well, when we talk about the well-being of the community, we need that same sort of systemic approach. We need to be recognizing that, there's many roles that all of us play in the human services industry that all of us need to be able to accept responsibility, but there's no one coordinating all that. And often you are 100% right, Patrick. It's the police chief or police leaders that are the catalysts and the coordinators and the quarterbacks for these situations, because that's what we do. We fix problems. And rightly or wrongly so, what ends up happening is often that responsibility and commitment and accountability on the other partners isn't there.
well, it's a bit of Sisyphus, right? We keep pushing that rock up the hill, and day after day we keep pushing the rock up the hill. And you mentioned a key word in there, and that's responsibility and accountability. And here's what's interesting, right? So now you look around the country, you have these very controversial use of force calls where police officers are shooting and killing subjects that are having mental breaks. They're armed with knives, they're armed with guns, and the only question is asked is, why did the police have to kill them? Why couldn't they do something? Why couldn't, even our own president said it once, right? Why can't you just shoot him in the leg, Jack? Like, because it's not that simple. And what I would like more people to start asking, not just from the police perspective, but to insulate the police a little bit from this problem and say, well, where did this problem originate? How long has it been going on? Who's responsible? Like, if it's a 17-year-old that's out there doing this, where are the parents?
Yes.
What is their responsibility in this? What services, what have they done to try to mitigate the effects? Because, in the US, like they decriminalize, and maybe for a lot of good reasons, right? They shut down a lot of the institutions where people would formally, previously be institutionalized for issues that now they do outpatient service. It's a more humane way to treat people. And I don't disagree with that, but if you're going to make those decisions, well, then you also have to have an understanding of, well, here are the ramifications for a decision like that. You're now releasing people that have the potential to be dangerous out in the public. So who's going to be responsible for them? Is it the family? Is it the individual? Well, if an individual is, not mentally fit to be able to make these decisions, then it becomes whose problem? Why is it the police responsibility to treat and diagnose and make a correct assessment? No. That's why we partner with our mental health communities but then state levels did the same type of thing. Funding started to went away. And here, here's the sad reality, right? Is that if you don't have insurance and there's not someone that can pay for your care, guess where you're going? You're going to the street. That's because your family no longer either has the resources, patience, or they're no longer even around. Caregivers disappear, and now this person becomes a community problem. And it's not necessarily a police problem, but the police are the ones, that's where it lands in our lap all the time. Who do you call at 2:00 in the morning when there's nobody else to call? Well, of course you're going to call us, and we're going to show up, and we're going to do the best we can. But sometimes those things go bad. They go in the wrong direction. And yeah, and it seems the police are the only ones that anyone wants to hold accountable.
Yes.
And that's where the frustration comes in. And that's why you can't get police officers now in the numbers that we used to encourage others to come into the profession. It's just, the expectations are too great. The resources are too little. The risks are too high.
Yes, no, you've said that very, very well. And I was hoping that we would get to sort of the decrim piece a little bit, decriminalization. And I want to just jump on something that you said, first of all, is that no police officer wants to criminalize mental health. No police officer wants to criminalize addiction, right? That's not what the business we're in. We understand that handcuffs in jail isn't always the answer, but sometimes it's the treatment that comes between the handcuffs and the jail that assists people in being able to restore their quality of life within the community to a meaningful level. I know in Canada here, and certainly in British Columbia, we have decriminalized 2.5 grams of all hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl. So 2.5 grams and less, you now have the opportunity to be able to use that. The purpose of it, I'm fully supportive. We want to destigmatize drug addiction so that people who needed help could reach out for help and not feel stigmatized by it. So the theory is wonderful, built on the world-class Portugal model, which has come under scrutiny here lately by the Washington Post, and certainly the Portland model has come under scrutiny by the New York Times here just recently. But the fact is that, again, it's a system. If we don't have the method to be able to have treatment readily available that people can get into at an affordable cost, and that we know will produce valuable outcomes, or the outcomes that we're looking for, then all we're doing is we're just allowing people to carry on their addiction in an open format, which isn't helpful for them, isn't helpful for the community as well. So that's where we're struggling in British Columbia here right now, is I believe that, the foundation of the Portugal model was the fact that treatment was in place. So if someone came forward, they were addicted to drugs, they could receive treatment. The moment they're ready, they could enter into a treatment program and hopefully see some good results. But we don't have the treatment programs in place in Canada here in British Columbia that are necessary for that systemic whole person public health issues that they need.
Well, in sometimes, yeah, man, that's such a great point, and it really makes me feel good to know that chiefs get this. They're thinking about it. You have a very empathetic and compassionate perspective on this, but you're forced to live in reality because the responsibility is on you for what are you going to do on those 2 o'clock in the morning calls. And this is where I try, for my more compassionate liberal friends in the community that support these types of programs, you're not going to find a lot of police officers that disagree with them. Police officers don't want to go arrest the same person over and over again for something that we know they just need some help on, that we're not equipped to provide that type of help. I just think you have to have the will as a community to muster the resources and to say, look, maybe we'll give you one shot, maybe we give you two shots, but third time, we're not talking 3 strikes, you go to jail for the rest of your life. But I would like to see, if you've been arrested for an opioid related offense or a meth related offense, any type of addiction related offense, we might let you book in and book out once, regardless of what the crime is. But if it happens a second time, or if you get arrested for any reason for a second time, and do a quick test and we find out that you test positive, then it's automatic 6 months or 6 weeks or 3 months into a secure facility, whether it's a jail, whether it's a wing in a jail. And I think that those are the types of programs that are starting to pop up now in the States. And I know locally we're working on that. Well, now you're going to sit there for 3 months and we're going to get you clean. And then hopefully while you're clean, we can get you in a position to move you into recovery. But we can't get you ready until you're clean. And you can't get clean when you have a place to go to use every single night.
No, you're right on. And the reason why Portugal was seen as the world vision for how to treat drug addiction was the fact that, first of all, if the police caught you in a situation where you were using drugs in an appropriate manner, whatever that was, I'm not sure what their law was, but they would have you go to court, and the court said you could go for treatment or you could go to jail. So most people would choose treatment. If they chose treatment, when they came out, guess what? They got housing and a job. So they didn't come out and not be able to work. But they thought about it totally upstream about how you actually prevent this going forward after the actual interaction with police, rather than sort of it just being a revolving door. Many of the crimes you're speaking of, the break into the car, the theft from auto that you would see, or the theft of a catalytic converter to be able to support a drug habit, now we call survival crimes here in Canada. And it's the crimes have are often not looked favorably upon, by the Crown, because this person needed to do that activity to be able to survive. And I often think about the victims. Boy, oh boy, what about their rights in the whole piece? But somehow, the rights of the person who is suffering from the addiction seem to take precedence most of the time.
I'm assuming it's the same everywhere. And it is frustrating when victims don't have a voice and they're the last one that anyone seems to care about. Like, oh, well, oh gosh. And in this environment, in the last couple of years, it's just even, oh my gosh, it's gotten so much worse because everybody is to blame. Everybody is responsible. Everybody is at fault, except for the person doing the crimes and making these poor decisions. And I think we can all agree upon the fact that many of them come from really bad circumstances, but somebody's still got to be accountable at the end of the day. And we need to change systems if we want to have better outcomes.
Yeah. I totally respect and certainly honor, and I don't understand enough and continue to learn on it, the idea of trauma and generational trauma and how that is impacting people. So I'm certainly empathetic to people that have experienced trauma in ways that I will never totally understand. But there's still people that want to lead a good quality of life, and we can't let the trauma impact sort of how others lead their lives, right, as well. So there's a balance, and it's a very difficult balance, and we're on the razor's edge as police officers, and I don't have good answers for it, but I do know that we hire good people who make good decisions, and for the majority of all of our officers, I'm very proud of the work they do day to day in our community.
Amen. Yeah, you just said that a lot more sophisticated than I did. So here's what I tell my conservative friends, right? Because they lock them up, throw away the key, and I'm like, all right, well, I don't think even you have enough money in your pocketbook to be able to afford that. And is that really the right approach, or is it just an easy way to say, I don't want to deal with this problem?
Right.
And it's kind of like the complete inverse from what I have a very good friend one I grew up with in high school. He lives in Portland. He lives in downtown Portland, and we were just having this conversation. And we were having a conversation about homelessness, and he was just curious about like, man, what is it that we can do? Because he is very far left leaning, but he's also he's a brilliant guy. And he recognizes that, okay, this isn't, just letting these guys sleep on the sidewalk, where people are having to step over them or worry about, that's just not helpful. And I just told him, I was like, look, I'm like, he's a man of the world, right? He's lived in New York. He's lived in London. He's traveled extensively. I'm like, hey, do me a favor. I was like, just sit down and have a conversation with some of these guys, especially the ones that aren't, the ones that, maybe are not, or, having severe breaks or, schizophrenic or something like that. But, some that, that maybe you got them in the moments where they're not drunk, they're not high, they're somewhat lucid. I'm like, just sit down, buy them a cup of coffee and ask them. I was like, that's what cops do all the time. I'm like, we talk to these guys, when community members call and say, hey, I got this homeless guy hanging out in front of my business, and people they're afraid. They don't want to come into my store because he's aggressive in his panhandling or all these other things. Right. So, one person's issues are affecting another person's ability to live their life the way that they want to live their life. So I'm like, do yourself a favor, sit down and have a conversation with them, and then report back to me and tell me what you think, and what ideas do you have to try to make this better. And so I'll have to keep everybody posted on how that goes.
Yeah, I would love to hear it. I'd love to be able to sort of to understand someone else's take on it, because as our police officers do that often, and they do a wonderful job trying to assist people in whatever circumstance they're coming from. I should just say one thing before we end here. I just should say, we're not perfect. We are human, and certainly we certainly are prone to be able to make decisions and make mistakes. But again, I think if you were to look at the vast majority of police officers, they do exceptional work every day, and as chiefs, we should be very proud. So that's where I'll end, Patrick.
Yeah, well, I agree. I'm very proud of the work that our officers do across the country, hands down. It's one of the most difficult jobs and tasks that anyone has been, in my mind, that's ever really been given. It's there is no win. Oftentimes it's, how do we mitigate the worst possible, outcomes here? And that's a tough thing to deal with. And then we didn't really even we're going to have to go part two, because we really didn't even get into, what we kind of talked about at the beginning, right? Is how do we treat the whole officer, and how do we keep them whole and healthy throughout their whole career, when every single night we're asking them to go out and deal with these issues and see the worst that humanity has to offer, and then go home and then just act like, well, this doesn't affect me, this doesn't bother me, I'll come back. And I read something that it was, just kind of re-energize my mission to raise awareness, to help people understand that, our police officers, 99.99% of them are great police officers. They're doing great work. We need to support them. We need better education. We need better training. We need better technology. We just need more investment, because even as we've gotten better at recognizing the dangers and the traumas that police officers face, and the more that we've tried to educate them, our rates of suicide have never been higher. Our rates of cardiovascular disease have never been higher.
Yes.
So we've got a lot of work cut out for us. And Chief, I really appreciate you spending your time, and I love to hear your perspective, because, man, you get it. You understand. You're the Delta Police Department is lucky to have a leader like you running the ship.
Patrick, I really enjoyed our time together, and certainly, we can do a whole nother session on sort of creating this care culture we need to create within our organizations to care for our people. And certainly that is, as you become more experienced, I notice how I didn't say old, but experienced, like yourself and myself, right? We begin to understand how important that care is. And if we can imprint that to our young officers so that they carry that with them for a 30-year career, we'll be much better off than sort of how we dealt with our own self-care in the younger years of ourselves. But you do great work. I appreciate all the stuff you do in relation to wellness, and I just encourage you and keep up with the CrossFit.
Oh, not a problem there. Hey, this is the CrossFit Games, so I'm not sure when this episode will air, but
there we go.
you got a couple Canadians, I think. Pat Vellner, he could be the guy this year. It could be Brent Fikowski. He got off to a great start yesterday.
Oh, that's good.
Of course, on the women's side, you've always been, super strong. And I don't know. I think it's all wide open this year. It's all wide open. Last couple things. We'll do this kind of rapid fire. I love to add, what's the most impactful book you think you've ever read? Outside of the Bible. I know I like, Bible's good. Everyone likes to go default to that, but
oh yeah, you know what? Probably Jocko's book, Extreme Ownership, right? I really enjoy him and enjoyed that book.
All right. What book are you currently reading?
I am currently reading a book on coaching, how to do executive level coaching, and I'm learning a ton about it. Flow coaching, it's called. Yep.
Steve. Oh, is it who wrote it? It's not Stephen Kotler, right?
Oh no, not him, but Chandler. I think Chandler is the last name.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we didn't even get into that topic either. Talking about the role of coaching, and of course, our sponsor for the show, our main sponsor, is Performance Protocol, and they're bringing executive coaching into policing, and that's a whole nother episode, right? But that's cool. All right, Flow Coaching. That's the name of the book.
Yes, you betcha. Yes, that is the name.
I would. So here's, I read a lot of books. So podcast people that I bring onto the show, everyone seems like, I'm like, holy crap, cops are amazing people. Like, they're all writing books. I'm like, I guess I need to write a book, because everybody else is writing books. But all right, everybody, I better shut up right now, or else we'll be talking for another half hour and you guys tune me out. So Chief Neil Dubord from the Delta Police Department, also the host of the Bend Don't Break podcast. I appreciate you being on the show. Last thing, where can people get a hold of you? What's I guess any of the podcast channels we could probably find Bend Don't Break, correct?
Absolutely. Bend Don't Break is on all the podcast channels. And certainly if anyone wants to reach out to me directly, deltapolice.ca. So easy to find, just Chief's office, deltapolice.ca, and you'll be able to get right into our website and email me directly. So no issue there at all.
Awesome. All right. Until next time, I'm out, and we're 10:42. Log into www.performance-protocol and learn more about how to bring this program to your agency and community.